Hello, my name is Cameron Kars. I'm a cloud solutions architect with Microsoft's Global Partner Solutions Group. Today, I'm going to be doing a Modern Analytics Academy vignette. This is a follow up to our Modern Analytics Academy, which you can find at aka.ms/MAA. The reason we're doing these vignettes is to discuss new features as they come out, to answer questions that we receive from partners about more stuff they would like to see, or just updates to previous sessions in this academy. Today, I'm going to be talking about Power BI deployment pipelines. So as you can see in the 5 pillars that we've kind of talked about in the Modern Analytics Academy, this, as the name implies, falls squarely under visualization inside Power BI. So this is the agenda. We're going to have an overview of what Power BI deployment pipelines are, their use cases, why you might use the deployment pipelines. There'll be a demo of how to do an initial setup and how to make changes. We'll look at how you might automate this process, and then we'll look at best practices. So the idea behind Power BI deployment pipelines is that you'll have basically 3 workspaces, a dev, a test, and a prod. And each workspace will have the same information as the previous one. So you'll do all your dev work, your development work in dev, and that will point to your dev database, your dev data source. Once you're satisfied with it, it meets any of your peer review requirements, what have you. You can then use the Power BI deployment pipelines to move that over to the test workspace. Now, instead of just copying this from workspace to workspace, we can actually change the settings so that that report and its data set are now pointed at the test database, the test data source. So you can actually look at the test information. And the same thing when we move from test to prod. That report and data set are now looking at the prod database, the prod data source. All right, use cases. So let's look at some use cases here for why you might use Power BI deployment pipelines. A big one is that reducing the load on your production environment, especially if you're using direct query. If you have separate dev, test, production, data source environments, it's best to utilize those at the end reporting. You don't want all your report development to be causing issues with your production level reports. This is also good because your development database can be shortened. It can be cut down so that it's not overwhelmed with everything that's in production. It also gives you control over permissions between the environments. Like, let's say you have sensitive data in production. This way, you can have developers that are working in dev and test who don't see that information, but can still work on reports with that dev and test environment. And you can control who has access to which workspaces, which apps, etc. The Power BI deployment pipelines also have the ability to be automated via the REST APIs or Azure DevOps. So yeah. Well, let's dive into a demo about how to set all of this up here. So in this demo, what I've done is I've got 3 Azure SQL databases with just the AdventureWorks sample DB loaded. So I've just gone into each database and I've deleted some records from the sales LT customer table. So you can see prod as 847, test 271, dev 135. I've named the databases just dev test prod. So we've got each workspace is going to point to a different database using these Power BI deployment pipelines. The report's just going to have one visual, a record count, a customer. That'll just make it easy to see which connection we're in. All right, so let's start the demo. All right, let's get started with this demo. So the first thing I've done here is I've created my 3 workspaces that I'm going to need. I've got a dev workspace in Premium, got my test workspace in Premium, got my prod workspace in Premium. So that's what you need to get started. So let's flip over to the Power BI report here. Very simple Power BI report. All it's doing is getting the record counts of customer in the customer table here. You can see I put a text box here, so just to write out how many records are in dev, test, and prod. So we can pretty much look right away and know which environment we're in. So right now we're in dev. And if you look at the data source settings here, you can see I'm connected to my Azure SQL DB, and we are also connected to the dev. So let's go ahead and publish this to the dev workspace. Changes. Success, great. So you've got a few options. So if I come into the dev workspace and refresh it, you can see the data set and the report I just put up are good to go. If I come here and look at the report, it's going to be exactly what we just published. So you can either create a pipeline here right in the workspace, or you can go to this deployment pipelines, whichever. It'll take you to the same page. But let's create a pipeline here. I'm gonna call this one just Cameron Cars PBI deployment pipelines example. Create. And so you can see it lays it out: dev, test, prod. And first thing we need to do is assign workspaces to these. So I'm going to assign my dev workspace, assign my test workspace, assign, and my prod workspace, assign. And what you'll see now is actually, if you come over here to the dev workspace, let me refresh the page, you'll see that this says development. It's a development workspace now. Test workspace is a test. They're kind of grayed out, so you know it's not prod. And then prod, blue, prod, production workspace. So you can see here that it's saying, oh, there's one data set, there's one report we can look at between dev and test. Let's compare. So it's saying, yep, obviously test is blank. We've got a new data set and a new report. So the first time you do this, initially you're going to deploy to test. And so the initial time that you run this, it's just going to copy exactly what's in the data set, exactly what's in the report over. So this test environment is still, this data set still pointed at the dev environment. So we need to change that. Because the first time you do it, it just copies it over. But you can come in here to this data set, for instance, and you can say, hey, let's configure a rule. And we're going to add a new rule here. So for this data source, the dev, my server here, we're going to replace it with another. The new database, going to be my test database, which I've named test, same server. And if you have different servers, you can add that in as well. But I'll go ahead and save this rule. So you can see the rules will be applied when you deploy to this stage. So actually, when I come back out, see, they're no longer matching up. So you can see, oh, this pipeline and that pipeline are actually different. So what I need to do to make this work after the initial one, deploy this to test again. Okay, great. And so I can click on this to refresh all the data sets, but since it's pointed at a new connection, it's not going to have the credentials. So what we can do is you can go into the workspace here. You can come into the settings, and I can see under data source credentials, it's now pointed at that test database. And so I'm going to give it the credentials here. Private, yeah. And the settings have been applied there. Perfect. So now, if I go here and I refresh all the data sets in this workspace, see, what is it, 1025, success, come here, see, 1025. So then if I'm in the test workspace and I click on this report, you can see, boom, we get the same report, but we're now pointed at that test database, 271 records. Great, exactly what we want to see. let me back out here. So then same thing, moving from test to prod. So, we'll compare here. See, there's a new data set, new report. So we'll deploy. And again, the first time you deploy, it's basically just doing a copy. You need to edit the rule for that data set and say, hey, don't point at test, point at the production database. So we'll do the same thing here. We'll configure the rules, add a rule. So we're going to choose that test DB. You're going to say other, and we're going to point at my prod database on the same server. And you can see here again, yep, those aren't matching up. So we need to redeploy. All right, great. And so this data set, it doesn't have the credentials yet because it's the initial. So if I come here, I can give it the credentials. And it's good to go. And you can refresh it obviously from the workspace here, or you can do it in here. Once it's all set up, after the initial setup, you won't have to go back in and enter whatever the credentials are. But I can go ahead and refresh this data set here. It looks like it succeeded. And so we'll refresh this page here too. Yeah, 1027. Yeah, looks about right. Let's take a look at the report. Yeah, prod 135. So this report is indeed pointing at prod. So the last bit, of course, your production, usually you're going to have an app. So, if I click update app here, it's going to take me to that production app. This is the end here. So let's call this prod app. That's all fine. And so I'll publish this. And take me to the app. A very simple app, but you can see the app again is pointed at prod. So that's how you set this up for the initial setup. So what happens if you were to start making changes to the data set, start making changes to the report? Well, let's take a look at what this looks like after the initial setup. So we're back here in the Power BI. Let's say I want to add some more tables here and some more visuals. So let's say I go into transform data. I'll go to recent sources. Let's say it's just not enough. I want to know about the customers. I want to know about the customer addresses as well. And we'll link that with address. Do an import. Okay, great. And you can see it's linking to the sales LT address and the customer based off the customer ID and address ID. But that's fine. We don't need to worry about that for right now. So it's going to import those into the data set here. Great. It should automatically make the relationships for us. Yep, you can see all as it should be there. Okay. So let's just say I want to get in. I want to know who all the people are. Let's say, first name, last name, and then I want to know state, province, right? Just as an example. And then let's say I want to do state, province. We'll do count a state, province. So you can see a lot of California, and I can click on this, and there's all my California people, right? But I've made some changes to the report. I've added visuals. I've added tables. So let's save this. Let's see how the process works once you're making changes to things. Save it. All right, so I will publish this back up to dev. Yep, going to be replacing that report. Success. All right. If we come back here, we can go to the dev workspace and should be able to see changes in the report here. Yep, just as we expected. So if I come back out to the pipeline here um, and refresh this, you see this compare. We've got, it's a different, there's tables have been added, visuals have been changed, but let's go ahead and deploy that to test. Great, so deployment complete. Let's go ahead and refresh that data set. All right, so if I come to test here, and I take a look at this report, so this is the test workspace, you can see I've got the new visuals, I've got the test records. And you can see I've deleted a lot of the people with names from my customer list for this example. But anyways. All right, so then same thing for production, but you notice that time I didn't have to re-edit the credentials or anything for the data set. So great. So, we compare here, up different, data set, obviously, because the tables, different visual, because we've added some visuals. So let's go ahead and deploy here as well. Great, good. And then refresh all these data sets in the workspace. Okay, great. Come over here to prod. And we can see those changes reflected as well. So in the prod environment, take a look here. Yep, I've got the new visuals. I'm definitely pointed at the production environment. And the last piece, of course, you can update the app, the production app that your report viewers are going to be using. So you come here, you can click on update app. You can update it in the workspace too. It's however you want to do it. It's all going to navigate you to the same place. But once you've moved stuff into production, updating the app. And so if I come over here to the app, should refresh this and get the new stuff. So you can see. Yeah, that will pretty much conclude this demo. All right, let's look at how you can automate these Power BI deployment pipelines. So using the REST APIs, there's a handful of commands that you can use like any other REST API to hit these Power BI deployment pipelines. You can get pipeline information, deploy, create, delete, managing the workspaces, and managing the users who have access to the pipelines. This works like any other REST API, and you can incorporate it however you see fit in your process. There is also a way to do it in Azure DevOps. There's a tool called Power BI Automation Tools. It's an open source Azure DevOps extension on GitHub. Service Principal is recommended. It can do a lot of the same tasks as the REST APIs, but you can incorporate it into the Azure DevOps pipelines. You can assign workspaces to different pipeline stages, add users to those deployment pipelines, add users to workspace, and deploy content to the deployment pipelines, etc. So those are just two ways that you can automate this inside of your business. So let's go over some best practices. Now, these are best practices for Power BI deployment pipelines, but they are also just best practices for Power BI in general. For content preparation, treating each workspace as a complete package of analytics. It's ideal for your report developers to be able to come into a workspace and have everything they need in that workspace, instead of having to get data sets from a bunch of different workspaces to get the report they need. So if you can treat each workspace as a complete package of analytics, that's ideal. Planning your permission model. If you're able to ahead of time say, hey, these are the people that are going to have access to dev and test and prod, who's going to be a report viewer, who's going to be a report developer. These are great things to think about before you get to those stages. And then, of course, connecting different stages to different databases, which is exactly the whole point of Power BI deployment pipelines. Continuing on with the content preparation, you should use parameters in your model where you can't use these Power BI deployment pipelines. Not every data source in Power BI is supported in the Power BI deployment pipelines, but a handful are. Those that aren't, you can use the older method of using parameters to have the connection of your data source parameterized depending on which workspace it's in. So for your development environment, using Power BI Desktop is your best bet. You can edit reports in the browser, but again, Power BI Desktop is going to be a little bit faster, a little more reliable. Versioning control for your PBIX files is a must. Any sort of system you have in place for that is great, whether that's SharePoint or the OneDrive sync into the workspace. Whatever you want to do for version control is good. Separate modeling development from report and dashboard development, meaning it's ideal to have like a blank report with a data set or a data flow, and then to edit that and get that exactly how you want it, and then have your other reports and your dashboards point to that data set. This way, if you need to make changes to the data set, you can come in and only make changes to a data set. That way, if you need to make changes to a report, you can come in and only make changes to a report without affecting the underlying data set, and vice versa. For your test environment, it's always good that your test database, your test data source should simulate your production environment. You should, of course, measure performance. You can do that using the Power BI Performance Analyzer inside Power BI Desktop. You can also measure it in the browser. And of course, this would be a stage where you want to maybe publish your app just to make sure everything is on the level before you move to production. And finally, in production, you of course want to manage who can deploy to production, so you're not getting people deploying when maybe they shouldn't have, and then your end report users are seeing stuff that wasn't meant to be deployed just yet. And of course, at the end of the deployment pipelines, like we did in the demo, make sure you're updating the production app at the end of the pipeline. And quick fixes to content. It's important that once this pipeline is established, that you stick with it. If you get something pushed all the way to production and you realize there's a small mistake, it might be tempting to just push a new report to production right away, to just publish that PBIX right to production. But it's important to go through the steps to make sure the pipeline stays healthy and that you can test it each step of the way. So that pretty much concludes this Modern Analytics Academy vignette on Power BI deployment pipelines. Again, if you want to look for more of these vignettes, or you want to look at the 5 pillars of the Modern Analytics Academy, you can go to aka.ms/MAA. Again, I'm Cameron Kars, Cloud Solution Architect with Microsoft's Global Partner Solutions. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day. Thanks. Bye.